The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump is demanding that climate change, quote, come back because it was cold yesterday in parts of the United States. Of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, it's what we know of as winter right now. And the problem with this is that there are actually a lot of low information people, voters, some of them, who confuse climate change with weather. And we've been dealing with this confusion for a really, really long time. And much like with most of our problems, if people weren't just ignorant to the facts, we wouldn't be dealing with a lot of these issues to begin with. Anti-vaccine sentiment is an example. People who think supply-side economics works. I could give you many examples, but today we're talking about people who either don't understand or are pretending not to understand the difference between weather and climate. And there's a really long history of climate change deniers who deny climate change by pointing to a cold day, often in winter, in parts of the country where it's normally cold in winter. Here's one example, one of my favorites from Fox News from years ago at this point.
Outside, and it is frightful. Currently, for the most part, the 48 connected states are nice and dry, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest. That's the good news. The bad news is, man, is it cold. Right now in Minneapolis, the air temperature is 9 below zero. International Falls in Minnesota yesterday had a recorded temperature of 37 degrees below zero. That is the coldest temperature that town has had since 1911. Yeah, that global warming thing's really kicking into high gear, isn't it?
Wait, so you're telling me that in winter it was cold in Minnesota? Clearly climate change couldn't possibly be real, right? And I have a ton of these clips that I could play for you. I'm not going to today. I think you understand it. What's at issue here is weather versus climate. When we talk about weather, we're talking about the day-to-day state of the atmosphere, the short-term variation over a few minutes, few hours, days, maybe even a couple of weeks. Climate is the weather of a place over a long period of time, years, decades, 30 years, we could say. When we talk about, is it a record cold or a record hot day today or this week, that's really a conversation about the weather. When we say, oh, over the last 10 years, we've had more and more record high and low temperatures every single year on average, those are conversations about climate and how climate is changing over time. When we talk about a particular hurricane, we're talking about a weather event. But when we talk about the connection to climate on the basis of how many more and more serious hurricanes are we having over a long period of time, that becomes a conversation about the climate. So in comes Donald Trump, known for claiming that climate change is a hoax concocted by the Chinese. And last night he decides to tweet, quote, in the beautiful Midwest, wind chill temperatures are reaching minus 60 degrees, the coldest ever recorded. In coming days, expected to get even colder. People can't last outside even for minutes. What the hell is going on with global warming? Please come back fast. We need you. Whether Trump actually believes this or not, this is weaponized ignorance. That's what that's a term that unfortunately we've had to use a lot during this administration. For a very long time, I was 100% convinced that Donald Trump was trolling people with his climate change nonsense about China and whatever else. I am more and more convinced, Pat, that he genuinely doesn't get it and that this is not him merely trying to trigger people who believe the science. Like on many issues, I think Trump actually doesn't understand what's going on.
Same here. I think he does buy into the climate change doesn't exist conspiracy theory, and he's definitely spreading it. Whenever he's asked about climate change, he just reiterates that we want clean air and clean water, but that's all he'll say. And I remember a couple months back during the California wildfires, he visited the land there and promised that they would never happen again. So what is he doing to ensure that promise? Nothing, essentially.
Yeah, it's truly bizarre. And just as a point, I mean, at this point, I've said this so many times before, every serious climate change model predicts erratic weather, meaning record highs and record lows. The fact that it's cold in winter should not be news in any way when it comes to weather versus climate. But in addition to that, when you actually talk about climate change models indicate that you would see regularly set high temperatures, record high temperatures, and record low temperatures. And that's why this anti-intellectualism and pseudo-intellectualism, in some cases in the Republican Party, this is the party where a senator brought in a snowball to the Senate thinking that that in some way has any bearing on the issue of climate change and the environment and pollution. This is a weaponization of anti-intellectualism and also anti-education sentiment. And it is quite literally putting our planet at risk. It's not a figure of speech or a metaphor. It is putting the planet at risk. And the president of the United States is a part of the problem and is being laughed at by leaders around the world who simply don't include him in conversations about how to deal with this issue anymore. We've been covering for you for months now the most transparent administration in American history, which stopped for 41 days giving press briefings altogether. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is Donald Trump's press secretary, and she has been giving fewer and fewer press briefings over time. And up until yesterday, it had been 41 days since the last one. And all of the normal stuff that we've become accustomed to at these gong show press briefings took place. And I wouldn't be shocked if we don't hear from her again for a very, very long time. Not answering questions, blaming Democrats for everything, and generally speaking, making a fool out of herself, coming out and speaking after, I think it was Stephen Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow, and maybe one other person who spoke before her, speaking to the press. Out comes Sarah Huckabee Sanders, starts getting asked very reasonable questions, like, for example, we have this 3-week stopgap measure, which reopened government. Trump had no money for the wall. Does Trump want another shutdown starting on February 15th? And her answer is, it's the fault of Democrats.
Is the president really willing to go through another shutdown if he can't get any money out of the Democrats for the border wall?
The president doesn't want to go through another shutdown. That's not the goal. The goal is border security and protecting the American people. Ideally, Democrats would take these next 3 weeks to negotiate in good faith, as they've indicated that they would, and come up with a deal that makes sense, that actually fixes the problem, so we don't have to go through that process.
So what she's saying is Trump had the House and the Senate for 2 years during a supposed immigration crisis that was going on then, because it was worse then than now. If it's a crisis now, it had to have been a crisis then. Did nothing to build the wall. Democrats take the House back, and now Trump says either Democrats fix this problem or I shut down the government. It's an absolute and total joke. It's a farce. Next question. The stuff that Trump offered to Democrats in that second crazy immigration speech. Remember when he said, I will do 3 years of extension on DACA recipient status. I will do 3 years extension on TPS, temporary protected status. Reasonable question from the press. Is that still on the table? Trump offered it. Is it still on the table for Democrats? Sarah Huckabee Sanders won't say.
The president's proposals for protecting the Dreamer children, some of the other concessions he made in his immigration speech, are those still on the table?
Look, I'm not going to negotiate here. That's why they have the conferences for congressional members to work through some of those things, come back to the president with a deal. The president has laid out things in the past that he's willing to do. We'll see what they come back with. But what I do know is if they don't come back with a deal, that means Democrats get virtually nothing.
So first answer was it's the fault of Democrats and they need to fix this. Then the question is Trump's offer still on the table? She won't say, but she again says it's up to Democrats to figure this out or they get nothing. And then it gets brilliant in the sense of being evil genius. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is asked, why did Trump hire undocumented immigrants at his businesses? And of course, there is no good answer for that other than to just tell the truth, which is this is what companies do. People like Trump and corporations hire undocumented immigrants and they don't get in trouble. So obviously they're going to keep hiring undocumented immigrants. Check out what she says. Truly Orwellian.
The president has described illegal immigration, unchecked illegal immigration, as a perilous threat, and has said that they're taking American workers' jobs. Can you explain why the president hired and employed so many undocumented immigrants at his clubs for years and didn't do more to prevent them from staying employed and working there?
Look, I can't get into specifics about the president's organization outside of the White House. I'm only allowed to speak on behalf of the president in his official capacity. I do know that the Trump organization has put out a statement addressing that issue. I'd refer you to that and to them for further questions.
John, what does the president think? What does the president think should happen to a business that employs illegal immigrants and doesn't use systems to check and make sure they're not doing that?
I think that's one of the reasons that the president wants to actually fix the problem. He's one of the people that's identified the fact that we have a problem and we should fix our immigration system. If Democrats want to get serious about fixing that, they have a president that's more than happy to sit down with them and do exactly that. John?
Yeah. Hey, the president's company hired undocumented immigrants. What about that, and what should happen to those companies? Listen, Trump identified this problem. I guess she means by being part of the problem. And if Democrats want to fix it, then Democrats can fix it, and he'll allow them to do that. It's evil genius. It's just it's completely vapid in every sense. And I need to congratulate CNN and MSNBC. They didn't air this. OK, Fox News ran the press briefing live. CNN and MSNBC just stuck to their regular programming. And I've been saying for a while, if you can't fact check it live, since it's so lie riddled, run it later, condensed with fact checking, even do a 5-minute delay so you can do fact checking on screen. I think that there's more going on here than she's just a liar and an obfuscator. I actually think part of the reason she's not answering questions is I don't know that Trump is really speaking to Sarah Huckabee Sanders anymore. I actually think she doesn't know what Trump is thinking and what Trump's positions are on a lot of these issues. And remember, we were told the most transparent administration in history. That ship has certainly long sailed. Let me know your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Carlos Arrington. Carlos, I really appreciate you supporting the David Pakman Show. Also want to give a shout out to today's longtime sustaining member of the day, Tony Granholm, who's been with the show almost 5 years. That is like 350 Scaramucci's or something like that. I don't even know how long that is relative to how long Scaramucci was White House communications director. Carlos, Tony, thanks to both of you. You can join them today at www.joinpakman.com. You can also get on our mailing list by signing up at davidpakman.com. And then on this Saturday, which is the day of my birthday, we are going to be doing a birthday membership special. It is going to be a blowout with the goal of making 2019 the most successful year for new memberships in David Pakman Show history. That is going to be extraordinary. If you think that you want a membership, but you want to get a discount, get on our newsletter mailing list. And on Saturday, you'll get an email explaining to you exactly what to do to take advantage of that deal. Okay, if we want to take advantage of having data to figure out whether a particular policy has succeeded or failed, we need two things, or I guess you could say we need at least two things. We need time to allow that policy to either succeed or fail, or maybe do neither. But we also need to know what to measure, right? Just having data isn't useful unless we know what are we looking for? What would be a sign that a policy has succeeded or failed? We can now apply this sort of paradigm, this infrastructure, to look at Donald Trump's tax cuts. And I say that with some reservation because it wasn't actually a tax cut for everyone. And even some of the people who did get a tax cut in the short term, it's not a permanent tax cut. But I think you know what I'm talking about when I say the Trump, quote, tax cuts. So we've had some time. It's been a little while. Now we're starting to get a sense of the effect. But what should we measure to figure out whether the tax cuts have been successful or not? Well, I think the most relevant way to do this would be to look at what Donald Trump claimed would be the effect of the tax cuts and see if it was. And the big picture was that the tax cuts will reduce government revenue in a sort of short-term micro way, but they are going to cause the economy to grow so much, the economy is going to be on fire, that the tax cuts will pay for themselves and will reduce the deficit overall. So tax cuts go down, so government revenue goes down, but the tax cuts that rich people and corporations gets put right back into the economy, and it will trickle down and generate so much new income and productivity that government revenues will actually go up, and then they can reduce the deficit and start paying off the debt. This hasn't happened, okay? To make it very short for you, we have a new report from the National Association of Business Economics. 84% of respondents, businesses, have not changed plans as a result of the corporate tax cut. 75% say they have not, nor do they have plans to increase hiring. So think about that for a second. Corporate tax rate goes from 35% to 21%. That's a 40% cut, okay? Going from 35 to 21 is a 40% decrease in the corporate tax rate. 84% of businesses make no change to their capital investment at all. The other 16 are either increasing or some are decreasing capital investment. Remember, the other 16 aren't all increasing capital investment. Those who are increasing capital investment and are increasing hiring need to now make up for a 40% reduction to the corporate tax rate to make this tax plan deficit negative, meaning that it reduces the deficit. Obviously, it wouldn't. I mean, just think about this at the most basic level. If I'm a business owner and I get a tax cut, nothing else changes. Why do I hire people, right? Why do I go and choose to increase my operating costs by adding employees because I got a tax cut? I would hire more employees if there's more demand for my product or service. If I have the staff to make 100 widgets and the demand for my widgets is at 100 widgets, why would I go and hire people to be able to make 200 widgets? That would be a really dumb move. If all of a sudden the demand for my product goes up to 200 widgets, now I have a reason to go and hire employees in order to be able to accommodate that increased demand. If I get a tax cut and nobody wants more of my widgets, it would be stupid to hire more people. And the proof is in the deficit numbers. We were told this would be so good for the economy that we would start to cut away at the deficit. We might even start to pay off that national debt if we ever got to a surplus. And it's all nonsense. The reality is that we learned this week that the U.S. Treasury is going to have to maintain this increased level of borrowing, planning more than $1 trillion in borrowing for the second straight year. And it's partially because of Trump's tax cuts. It's partially because of other policies, all of which are increasing the deficit. You can argue we shouldn't be so worried about the deficit, and I would agree with you. But again, we are evaluating the policy on the basis of what Trump said it would do. It's completely predictable, and it plays right into China's hands, because to finance this deficit, we are selling long-term debt called 3, 10, and 30-year securities. Who is a big buyer of these securities? It's China. Trump told us he was going to take back control of our economy from China, and instead China and other countries are buying our debt so that we can finance our government operations despite increasing deficits, which Trump told us that he would reduce. It is lose, lose, lose. And the crazy thing about this, Pat, is that we knew it would happen. Our own government, the Congressional Budget Office, told us this is exactly what's going to happen. We knew it would happen. Serious economists knew it would happen. And they either didn't care or didn't believe it. And as usual, the estimates were right. Do you think they even care about this reality, or have they moved on to something else, Pat?
I would go even further and say that from the get-go, they knew that this wasn't going to work, that the tax cuts wouldn't just spur so much economic growth that they would pay for themselves. I think that they weren't arguing in good faith. They just wanted to serve their donors. They wanted to serve their corporate overlords. And when you think about what Trump was able to get done legislatively in his first 2 years, it wasn't much. He was pretty much impotent. He couldn't repeal Obamacare. He couldn't get his wall built, but yet again, he was able to get the tax cuts passed, and I think that's really telling.
The normal but David responses here are going to be, but David, what about X company which is hiring more people? Well, lots of companies are firing and not hiring despite getting tax cuts. But more importantly, if the tax cuts objectively created hiring more than just anecdotally, you would see most companies hiring more people, and hiring depends a lot on the underlying economic conditions, which have been good for years, although they're now slowing down. But David, what about X company which gave people raises? Lots of companies give raises periodically anyway. Others are announcing them, but are phasing them in over multiple years. Many of them would be giving raises regardless of tax cuts. What matters here is the aggregate, not individual anecdotal stories that we can tell. And the aggregate is just not good for these tax cuts. And every month we get more and more data to support that. This next story would be the story in a normal presidency if we didn't have this temper tantrum government shutdown over a non-crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border, if we didn't have countless indictments and convictions around Donald Trump and Trump making threats to his personal attorney about investigating his father-in-law if Michael Cohen chooses to testify before the Senate or the House or whoever. If we didn't have that stuff, the news that Jared Kushner, a close advisor to the president and his son-in-law, was rejected for a top secret security clearance but got one anyway, would be, and it should be, a front page story. It's unfortunately barely a blip, but I am going to tell you about it today. Security clearances in general have been an issue for the Trump administration since they took office. Remember that Trump campaigned on Hillary can't be trusted with sensitive information or classified data or her emails. But then we found out that Trump spilled secrets in the Oval Office to a Russian spy recruiter. We found out that Trump had a whole bunch of people working for him with temporary clearances, some of whom we suspected couldn't even get clearances permanently. And Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, an advisor, and someone who shouldn't even be working in this capacity at all, has actually been rejected for that security clearance, but he got one anyway because the supervisor decided to overrule the decision of career security specialists. Why was the determination made not to give Jared Kushner a security clearance? Because of concerns about foreign influence on Jared Kushner. Understand that the normal process for getting a security clearance resulted in Kushner being rejected, okay? Because he was too under the influence of foreign powers and individuals. That decision was then overruled by a supervisor, and Jared Kushner got a security clearance. This is stunning because Kushner is, number one, such a close advisor to Trump. Kushner is, number two, as a result of that, so close to endless sensitive information. But what's even more outrageous about this is that it's not just Jared Kushner. There are an estimated roughly 30 or more people working for Donald Trump right now who were rejected from security clearances on the merits, but then were overruled by a supervisor and obtained those clearances anyway. Everything is backwards. The crisis at the border, that's not the crisis. The crisis is in the White House. It's in the Oval Office. The sensitive information liability wasn't avoided by voting for Trump instead of Hillary Clinton. It was created by voting for Trump instead of Hillary Clinton. At least 30 people should not have security clearances. And not only do they have them, they're working for Trump up to and including in very sensitive and privileged positions. There's a national security crisis right now. It's not people coming here for work from Latin America. It's all these people who shouldn't even be involved in this stuff who are making decisions about what our government does. And zoom out for a second here, okay? The president was investigated for being a Russian asset. Countless advisors and staffers are now being arrested, indicted, convicted, sent to prison in some cases because of the Trump-Russia investigation. And the dozens who haven't as of yet been found to be criminals, there are dozens who were rejected from security clearances but got them anyway and are now voting for, working for Donald Trump. It's absolutely wretched. It should be a front page story. It made a blip, and I get it, There's a dozen crises every single week. There's a dozen or 24 embarrassments coming out of this White House every single week. But for the party that claims to be concerned about national security and protecting the homeland and keeping people safe above all costs, there are people who were rejected for security clearances because of their potential or actually being under foreign influence, who ended up getting those security clearances and are making decisions that affect your security and that of your family and that of your loved ones and your friends. That's the actual crisis here, not people trying to get a job who are coming here from Mexico. Follow me on Instagram at david.pacman. Follow the show on Instagram at David Pacman Show. I'll be taking questions there tomorrow. We've got a great program coming up for you today.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Jack Stilgoe, who is Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies at University College London, where he studies the development of new technologies in society, one of which, Jack, is, of course, autonomous vehicles and self-driving technology, where we've now seen a sort of longer period of testing of different types by different companies. We've also seen some tragic accidents, including one particular story involving an Uber vehicle in the United States, which, of course, we've spoken about. Let's maybe start generally. When you look at the way in which self-driving autonomous vehicles are being tested today, concerned, pleased with the safety measures that are being taken?
Thanks for having me, David. The first thing to say, I guess, is that testing on public roads of these new technologies is necessary to an extent, because they simply will not be able to learn to drive purely in simulation or in test tracks. And so there will be this very difficult stage of engaging in a form of experiment in public, using the roads as a laboratory of sorts. Getting that right is extremely tricky. I think at the moment I am concerned, because I think we have a few players who see themselves as being in a sort of race to develop the technology first. And I think that creates incentives towards recklessness, which I think bodes ill for the long-term success of the technology, and also, as we've seen, for public safety. It may also force cities and planners and others into making bad decisions about the technology unless they're alert.
So we had the March 2018 Uber incident where a pedestrian was killed in Arizona. It was a major, major story. But one of the other stories surrounding this is, do we actually know the full extent of what has happened during testing? Because some pretty good investigative reporting is at least suggesting that there are tests going on, sometimes with less than favorable results, which we simply don't know about because it's not all being reported. Do you believe that this is a concern, and what do you know about it?
Well, I think it is a concern. I think if I'm right, and this is a form of experiment, and it's to an extent a necessary experiment, that at some point these technologies will need to be tested in the real world, in the wild, as it were, then the question is, what does a good experiment look like? And I think one of the first principles that we might apply to testing is at least for policymakers to be aware of what's going on. So at the moment, we have a situation where each company is, in effect, learning from its own experiments. And I think that's not in the public interest. I think if we can find ways that companies can learn from one another, and that the public sector can learn from the private sector, then that's probably the better way to get good outcomes.
What would you say are the key technological problems that need to be solved when it comes to the future of these types of self-driving autonomous vehicle technologies?
Well, the reason why they need to be tested in the wild is that some of the problems that they will encounter will be surprising ones. So in terms of the necessary development of the technology, I mean, we shouldn't forget that this technology is widely regarded as possible until relatively recently. And the reason why it is now seen as likely that we will have, self-driving cars on our streets or on the streets of some places within years is that there have been dramatic improvements in machine learning, which basically reduces the problem of driving to one of image recognition, prediction, and planning. So can the sensors on the car recognize the world around it, work out what bits of that world are going to do next, and then plan a safe route? The technological challenge there is absolutely vast, and in some places where it's being tested, the technology needs to improve only incrementally, because those places are relatively straightforward places. And you could say, there's a reason why they're being tested in Tempe, Arizona, for example, because Tempe is a relatively well-organized city. I'm here in central London. The prospect of a self-driving car being able to navigate its way from one corner of central London to the other anytime soon is far harder to imagine.
Yeah, even here in Boston, which is generally speaking a more London-like city in terms of the arrangement of the streets, the testing is almost exclusively happening in what we call the seaport area, which is much more like Tempe than it is like London. So that seems to be one issue. Another one that comes up often is a sort of version of the infamous trolley problem, the idea of imagine a self-driving vehicle hurtling towards a crosswalk, for example, where pedestrians have entered, and now the vehicle has to sort of make a decision as to whether it runs over 5 people in the crosswalk or drives onto a sidewalk and maybe only hits one person, but it's one person who is where cars are not supposed to be. Is that actually an issue that is going to be a complicated one to solve, or is that not really one of the primary problems that you identify in the way that the configuration and algorithms will be configured?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trolley problem is a distraction. I think the trolley problem, we should remember the origins of that, which is as a thought experiment in applied ethics designed to demonstrate the insolubility of a particular ethical dilemma. Right? There is no ideal way to make a choice in that example. Applying it to self-driving cars seems sort of interesting in a dinner party discussion type way. In policy terms, it's irrelevant. It does the technology too much credit. It presumes that the technology is going to be able to be omniscient and able to make calculations about numbers of people, and it also presumes something rather troubling, that we would want a technology to make judgments among types of people. But I think thinking through it and regarding it as a thought experiment, which is its proper status, we should take that and use it as a way to think about, well, there will be some ethical dilemmas. I mean, the Uber crash has already revealed a real ethical dilemma in technology design, which is the extent to which engineers balance so-called false positives against false negatives in the way that they calibrate their algorithms so that they don't get too jittery when there is something fairly harmless in their way, but that they do spot something important and recognize that it's something important when that thing poses a hazard. Uber got that very publicly wrong in March. In that case, that's a very real ethical choice, and it's that I'm concerned about, rather than a trolley problem, which also suggests that the morality here, the responsibility, sits inside the machine rather than with the designers and the developers of the machine.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could still say, of course, it's ultimately how the vehicle is programmed by the developers, and argue that it's still a question, but just one that the developers have to solve. But if we zoom out a little bit, are you generally optimistic that these problems are going to be solved and that this is going to be a growing technology, sort of a growing reality of motor vehicles in the world, or do you think that there's a chance that this doesn't happen?
So I think, something will happen, right? I'm a social scientist. I don't make predictions about technology, except that what I can see here, there is too much money being invested for nothing to happen. So I think there are interesting questions that relate less to when will this happen and more to where it will happen. I think, as we've discussed, some places like Tempe, Arizona might be easy wins for the industry. It might be far harder to see these things driving around, downtown Boston or Manhattan or Rome or New Delhi anytime soon. But I think there's something else that isn't being talked about, which is the question of what would it actually take to realize the benefits that are being suggested here. And there, I think, we're only hearing half a story at the moment. And you can imagine, actually, that if you wanted to realize the benefits of self-driving cars, you would do some of the things that town planners did with the arrival of the motor car in the early 20th century, which was to say, okay, here's a beneficial technology. In order to make this safer, we need to clear other people off the streets. It's not normally talked about by self-driving car developers, but actually one way in which you could make the system much more controllable is by getting cars to talk to each other and to infrastructure, and by segregating self-driving cars into their own lanes. It makes for a much more controlled system and a much easier engineering challenge.
Yeah, and that gets to what some believe will be really the danger, which is not the eventual endpoint where most or all cars are autonomous and they're interconnected, but this intermediate or transitionary phase where you have human drivers who now have to share the road with autonomous vehicles, and of course the autonomous vehicles who have to share the road with the human drivers. Is that transition period an area of significant attention required?
Well, yeah, the transition period could be never ending. It's relatively easy to imagine a world in which there are only self-driving cars.
Yes.
That it's much harder to imagine the mixed world, but we shouldn't forget that, we still haven't fully realized the transition from horses to motor cars. There are still horses trotting around on American and British roads. So those mixed systems happen, and we've introduced now other vehicles onto our roads: scooters, bicycles, various other forms of mobility. That transition will be difficult, and in that difficulty, policymakers will be faced with some really difficult choices. So when American cities chose, in effect, to privilege the motor car over other forms of transport, that had real effects on pedestrians. It had real effects on public transit in the US, which in some places has never quite recovered. It's slightly easier here in London because London is a city that predates the motor car. So there are still lots of parts of London in which it is really, really hard to drive and much easier to walk around. But for policymakers, they're faced with some very difficult choices about how to manage that transition.
Jack, in the limited time we have left, is there an income inequality angle to the development of autonomous vehicle technology?
So that's a great question, and it's one that not enough people are asking. The question, in effect, of who is likely actually to benefit from this technology. So before the technology is really tried out, it's very easy for the developers to say, here is a technology that is going to be emancipatory. It's going to allow people who maybe can't afford a car or can't drive a car because they are too young, too old, maybe they're disabled, maybe they're blind, and it's going to open up mobility to those groups. And it's very easy to make those sorts of emancipatory claims. I would worry, though, that the development of this technology will be likely to just follow the money, right? So it is likely to be a technology that is used by rich people to do rich people's things in rich places. And if we are serious about, even the safety claims being made for the technology, more than 1 million people a year die in car crashes, and most of those people are dying in the poorest places in the world. Do we really expect that a self-driving car is going to be deployed in those places and able to tackle that problem? Well, I fear not. So I think the sooner we ask the question, who is likely to benefit, the better we can make the decisions about the technology.
Yeah, extraordinarily important angle, and one that we think about a lot when we talk about CRISPR and genetic editing technologies. Very, very similar analysis exists there. We've been speaking with Jack Stilgoe, who's Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Jack, really a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We're continuing to measure the destructive impact of that recent government shutdown on Donald Trump's approval, and it's actually even worse than I imagined that it would be. We saw Trump's disapproval go up during the shutdown, but we now have a very good new poll out from the ABC News Washington Post polling consortium, which found that 48% of respondents, almost half of the United States, has no confidence, quote, at all in Donald Trump, as in none at all. 16% say that they have some confidence in Donald Trump, and just 21% of the country has a great deal of confidence in the president. This is the highest percentage to date from any time that this poll was done during Trump's presidency for the no confidence at all results. Also interesting from this poll, along gender lines, maybe not surprisingly, we see this frequently take place with Republicans, significantly higher approval on all questions for Donald Trump from men than women, whether it's being a strong leader, brings change, has the right personality and temperament, is a deal maker, is honest and trustworthy, understands your problems. Overwhelmingly more support from men than from women, reinvigorating the men going their own way, men's rights activist, alt-right, Venn diagram movement, call it what you will. The poll also asked about some specific policy issues, like, for example, has Trump met your expectations on a number of different issues? And on no issue did Trump actually meet voter expectations. Check this out. We have it on the screen for our visual audience. For only for dealing with the threat of terrorism does Trump hit a 50% net positive in terms of meeting people's expectations, where he has exactly a 50% net positive rating. On every other issue, A through K, the economy, race relations, creating jobs, helping the middle class, handling the deficit, healthcare, handling international crises, handling issues of importance to women, Supreme Court appointments, border security, the net positive rating is way under 50 in some cases, like with the deficit and healthcare. You do not get numbers this bad simply with a partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans, okay? These are really genuinely bad numbers, but the most important thing, any opportunity I have to mention this, Pat, I'm going to mention it. He can still get reelected with these numbers, okay? Half the country doesn't vote. Even with approval in the low 30s, you can win if half the country continues not to vote. It's tougher. We've seen presidents be reelected with approvals in the 40s. I don't think we've seen it with approvals in the 30s, but mathematically it can happen. So whenever we see these results, Pat, I report on them. I tell you what's going on. But if anyone is going to say, clearly this guy's losing in November 2020, that's the exact opposite of the attitude that we should be taking. Yeah, the power of incumbency, that's really strong. The last 3 presidents got reelected after all. And with our electoral college, it's actually possible for the winning candidate to receive only 23% of the vote. Now, that's probably not going to happen because that would mean that he wins 51% of the vote in a handful of states and then no votes at all in some other states. But just the fact that that's conceivable makes us realize that we have a real problem here and he could get reelected. That's exactly right. And that's further exacerbated by the fact that you can have very uneven voter turnout because so many people choose not to vote. I would love to talk to the 21% that have high confidence, according to this poll, in Trump's ability to deal with issues right now. Like which issues is he doing really well on? And we've had a few of these people call into the show who say, I support Trump. And I say, well, on what issue do you think he's doing a good job? And they'll name something. And after a couple of probing questions, they immediately fall apart or go to some other issue. So I would really like to, not to convince them to change their minds, but just to understand where they're coming from. I would love to hear, and maybe we will on live calls on the Friday show, hear from some of these Trumpists. Tell me exactly which issue you think he's handling competently. We've been talking about echo chambers that are created online based on these recommendation algorithms that exist. So this happens on Facebook. This happens on YouTube. This is happening on Instagram. Twitter, I'm not sure if they have this type of algorithm in place. But many places online, you are shown videos or articles or posts that are based on an algorithm that determines what you are most likely to engage with based on how you've reacted to other content. What have you shared? What have you spent time looking at? What have you clicked on or liked or whatever the case may be? This can be problematic because algorithms can be gamed and algorithms can also recommend content that for a variety of different reasons we might not want to see recommended. YouTube is one big place where this has been really, really controversial. And YouTube made an announcement over the weekend in a blog post that they are going to stop or at least reduce recommendations of what they call, quote, borderline content and content that could misinform users in harmful ways, such as videos promoting a phony miracle cure for a serious illness, claiming the earth is flat, or making blatantly false claims about historic events like 9/11. So the idea here is, if we look at Alex Jones as an example, before he was kicked off of YouTube, the idea is there are some very widely viewed videos, for example, about Sandy Hook shooting conspiracy theories. And when it becomes a problem is if people go on YouTube and they just want information about the event and they search for, I don't know, what happened at Sandy Hook or something like that. They could get a conspiracy video of Alex Jones claiming it was a false flag with paid crisis actors. It didn't happen in the way that supposedly the news tells us that it happened. That's an example. What YouTube is saying is not that they're going to ban the content itself unless it violates terms and conditions, which is sort of a different story. But what they're saying is they'll tweak the algorithm so that if you're just searching around for information on some of these topics, you're not going to get conspiracy videos placed in front of you. How much content will this impact? YouTube says that this will impact less than 1% of all content on YouTube. And again, this is not about whether the content is or isn't allowed. That's not changing. The reactions have been pretty predictable. Some so-called free speech absolutists are saying it's censorship. This is an attack on constitutionally protected free speech. And they're saying all of the things you would anticipate they would say. Other people are saying, well, hold on a second. YouTube can decide what content it wants to promote and what content it doesn't want to promote. The recommendation algorithm is merely how YouTube expresses what it wants to put a spotlight on and what it doesn't. Nothing illegal is happening here. Is this something that could inadvertently hurt people who aren't doing anything wrong? Sure. Yeah. I mean, people spreading misinformation are going to be hurt by this and they're going to be at a disadvantage. But people who are also doing great stuff are going to probably end up inadvertently caught up in this as well. Here's the reality. The recommendation algorithm on YouTube has always favored some content over others. It's changing all the time. It's never worked perfectly. The David Pakman Show YouTube channel has been hurt by algorithm changes at different points in time. We've had content that didn't do as well because of how the algorithm is configured. We've had content that was pushed viral on a whim that we didn't even understand because of the algorithm. I think that if we are given the choice between knowing more about how the algorithm works and knowing less, I prefer to know more. At least they're being upfront about this tweak. What people need to understand is that either way, YouTube is doing this stuff. I'd rather know about it. People can choose not to use YouTube if they so choose. And I am at risk for sure. And people could say, but David, aren't you going to change your mind about this if it ends up hurting you? You're not going to be so laissez-faire about it. It has hurt me at times. What can I do? YouTube can have an algorithm. It's ultimately up to me to decide, is being on YouTube at all a net positive or a net negative? And I can decide whether to keep putting my content there. I'm going to focus my time on making good content and promoting good ideas. If YouTube becomes too oppressive, if my traffic goes down because of the algorithm, then I'll start looking for other platforms. But the people who are wanting to have it both ways here, saying that companies should be allowed to do what they want as long as they're not breaking the law, but at the same time, YouTube's algorithm can't deprioritize conspiratorial content and sham medical treatments and all of this other stuff. How can you possibly take both of those positions? It doesn't make any sense. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's just sort of like an Ask David personal advice edition of the voicemail segment. Take a listen.
Hey, David. My question is, how do you cut toxic people out of your life? Do you just stop contacting them? Or you just delete them from your phone contact list, delete them from your Rolodex?
Yeah. You just stop talking to them. I've had an unfortunately high number of completely toxic people that have entered my life, sometimes directly, but often sort of more tangentially. They enter through another friend, for example, and then they start to have this just very, very negative impact on my life. And it doesn't have to be, my experience is that it's better. I've opted not to sort of have a conversation and say, listen, don't text me anymore. Don't call me anymore. I can't be involved with you anymore in those direct terms. I just sort of let it peter out. And that I find is better, because some of the most toxic people also will make your life a living hell if you directly tell them, please don't get in touch with me anymore. But yeah, I mean, it's basically, but by your actions, if not words, communicating that you just don't have the time, nor the interest, nor the availability to be pulled into that toxic nonsense. And I would do it sooner than later, because there is no upside to having those people in your life. It's I don't know if it's tough love or just obvious advice, but that's what you got to do. We've got a great bonus show today. Donald Trump is now touting Bible literacy classes for public schools. There's an idea. We will talk about internet addiction treatment programs in the United States, and also Tom Brokaw's recent comments, which have him in, I guess we could call it, some hot water, and a whole bunch of ancillary stuff coming up with Tom Brokaw after he said that it is necessary for Hispanics to better assimilate in the United States. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get instant access to the bonus show by becoming a member at www.joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.